You're a Fire Emblem fan, right? If someone asked you why you like Fire Emblem, what it does that's special from other SRPGs, what would you say? For me, map design is easily at the top of the list. Fire Emblem usually doesn't have the storytelling prowess or the depth of character customization of some other entries in the genre, but in exchange, its maps are so much more interactive. I think in many cases in Fire Emblem, you're fighting the map just as much as you're fighting the enemy. And as someone who's active in the Fire Emblem ROM hacking scene, I can tell you that the topic of what makes for a good or a bad map comes up all the time. So I think it'd be an interesting exercise to look at the roots of Fire Emblem map design, see what concepts this series explored before it was even a series. A lot of you will probably know that this game, Fire Emblem 1, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, has in fact been remade twice. Once for the Super Famicom as Book 1 of Fire Emblem 3, Mystery of the Emblem, and once for the Nintendo DS as Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. Both of these games are way more fun than FE1, but they also all play very differently. For this analysis, I'll be using FE1 with the help of the fan translation by Polinym as the baseline, and only bring up FE3 and FE11 when there are notable version differences. However, because most people who've played this story have done it through the DS remake, I'll be referring to all names and titles by their FE11 translation. Also, if I ever want to refer to these games collectively, I'll call them the War of Shadows games, because that is the name of Marth's first war in the canon. But with those disclaimers out of the way, let's hop right in. Chapter 1. Marth Embarks. Well, there's only one place to start, and that's at the beginning. Way at the beginning. Throughout this essay, I'll mostly be focusing on my own play experience for obvious reasons, but I do want to mention some alternative playstyles, especially for the very first chapter in Fire Emblem history. So, let's go back to 1990, and imagine you're some little Japanese kid picking up the controller for the first time. What do you see? Well, you start with 7 blue units, divided across 6 different classes. Now, while us experienced players can tell our armors from our archers, a new player may not necessarily be able to pick up these distinctions right away. So, the turn 1 of this first chapter is filled with interactable game objects that clue you into what the different classes are capable of. You start the game right next to a body of water, so you can immediately see that some characters, Marth and Sita, can cross water while others can't. Draug is also strategically positioned, so he just barely can't stand on this forest tile, showing that some tiles cost more movement than others. This map also tries to teach you which tiles are visitable right off the jump. Every character can reach the armory and at least one house. 6 characters can reach the village right here, but only Marth can visit it. By letting you try multiple options in a low-commitment environment, the game tries to teach new players these rules about who visits what without too much external pressure on them. Finally, there is a fort in the starting area, which looks pretty visually similar to a house or a village, but you're allowed to see immediately that there's no way to visit it. It's even colored white to contrast with the bronze, houses, armories, and villages, to reinforce that this tile is not like them. Finally, the first turn of this first map can teach the player about combat, which is honestly pretty rare for turn 1s of this game. The enemy that you can fight this turn, this thief here, is pretty notable, so let's focus on him for a bit. He's actually the very first anti-turtling incentive, or anti-turtle for short, in the series. Anti-turtle is a term that comes up a lot in ROM hacking circles as a way to coerce players into playing the map at a decent pace, and not, as the name implies, turtle the shit out of it and ruin the fun of your map in the name of safety. If you don't do anything to stop this thief, he'll take away the minor reward of 10,000 gold on turn 2. He will go for the second village after this, but a pirate will be blocking his way. Now, if we were to judge this thief by modern map-making standards, he'd be terrible at his job. You can kill him turn 1 and just turtle through the rest of the map after that, Or you can even ignore him and he will move towards the player party, so he's even easier to kill on later turns. That said, I think we can offer a bit of lenience in this instance, as the creators of the game needed to account for players who might take a long time to figure out how to even attack enemies. So I think it's pretty ambitious that they decided to include an anti-turtle at all. That said, once you do figure out how to attack enemies, he's pretty easy to deal with, and he can even teach you how ranged combat works by starting in range of Abel's javelin. He doesn't start in range of Gordon, so new players won't immediately learn how bows work, but there's an enemy hunter on this map that serves as a better tutorial anyway. Overall, I think he's a great enemy. He accomplishes quite a lot for how minor he is. Moving on from design elements only new players will experience, one thing I think every player is going to experience is this map's fantastic use of terrain. The main path of the level takes you through forests, forts, and mountains, and teaches you things about how all of them work very naturally. Forests and mountains I think are pretty easy to understand, but forts are by far the most complex of the three, so I want to draw special attention to how they're used in this map. We already talked about this right fort, but this top fort might honestly be my favorite tile in the game. It's a very natural tile to gravitate towards as a way to defend against these pirates charging across the water here, and it just feels so good to have that avoid boost and that defense boost, and that healing if you actually do get hit. It's so nice. And if you're a little too slow, and the pirates take control of that area around the fort before you do, then you're probably going to learn that forts give healing, especially since FE1 does give its enemies healing AI. And between all these different terrain types that are constantly shifting how you interact with the enemy, this is just a map that's super fun to just move through. The last map-specific thing that I want to point out here is that the boss actually has a special AI. He doesn't start on the throne, but he moves onto it on turn 1 enemy phase. This actually happens on all 3 of the first maps. It emphasizes the importance of the throne, and it reinforces the pirates' status as invaders, but I mostly want to highlight it because it's a tiny flavor detail that got programmed in on such primitive hardware. They had like half a megabyte to make this game, and they chose to spend a little bit of that space adding this little AI quirk to reinforce the story through actions in gameplay, and I think that's just awesome. Shozo Kaga, the creator of Fire Emblem, has always been praised for his willingness to create first chapters that are more complex than the dedicated tutorial maps of newer games. And while that's definitely oversimplifying things, there are 12 other people that worked on this game besides Kaga, and the space limitations on the NES definitely played a role in that decision. It's still a decision worth celebrating, because this map is incredibly fun on replay, as well as the first time around. The map just has such a satisfying pace to it, with a nice mix of enemies that charge you and enemies that wait until you enter their range, and the fact that you do get 7 characters right from the start means that on replays you can mix up which characters you give the most EXP to. Maybe you relied heavily on Jagan on your first run, and now you want to try feeding your growth units more. You know, you can actually give Jagan's Silverlance to Sita, and she can use it? That's a crazy amount of player expression. Modern mainline entries and ROM hacks would never let you do this. The enemies aren't super threatening, but that's fine for a first chapter, so overall I think Fire Emblem 1 definitely puts its best foot forward by leading off with an incredibly strong map. Chapter 2, The Pirates of Galder. Alright, we're not going to go that in-depth for every chapter. This video will never come out if I do. But Chapter 2 does introduce a couple new concepts, namely enemy recruits. Oh, yeah. You also got Riss at the end of Chapter 1. I'm not going to point out every character that joins your party, but this guy with his healing magic is the first character to introduce magical elements into the series. He's not that important in the grand scheme of things. I can kind of see why they cut him from FE3, but he's probably the most tragic cut from that game. Well, I'm actually really fond of another cut character. The one that joins his map, actually, Daros. Daros is our first recruitable enemy, and he's a pretty unique one. He's totally non-aggressive, he won't fight you, He'll just try and charge up to Marth and recruit himself. It's really rare for recruitable enemies to do this. Usually there's some puzzle to turn them blue without anyone dying, but I really like that they chose to do this here. Not only does this serve as a safe lesson in how recruitable enemies work, but it also adds a lot to Daros as a character. Occasionally, you'll see jokes on the internet about how one character's entire worldview is flipped on its head after talking to the Lord for 30 seconds. Not this guy. I don't doubt for a second that he wanted to join Marth's crew from the moment he heard they were at the harbor. Castor, the other recruitable enemy on this map, is a bit of a contrast to Daros and represents the more typical way recruitable enemies are set up. He's not going to recruit himself, but his battle quote does give a hint on how to recruit him. I like that Castor is a hunter. It means that when you see his battle quote, it's unlikely that whoever's fighting him is going to be able to counter him, and it makes it easy to close the distance between him and Sita without anyone being at risk of dying. You may wonder why I'm harping on the design of recruitable enemies so much, and that's because they're a really significant part of this game. Right at the end of Chapter 1, they tell you that there will be enemies you can recruit, and out of the 51 characters you can recruit in a single playthrough, a third of them, 17 characters, start as red units. If you're coming to this video from Three Houses or Engage, this might be shocking to you because enemy recruits have all but disappeared from the modern games, but they were a central mechanic in these older entries. And while ROM hacks do typically have recruitable enemies, the signposting here is decidedly different. In ROM hacks, if there's a recruitable red unit on the map, you'll typically see them highlighted at the chapter start event as your hint to recruit them. Here, the game uses a variety of ways to try and push the player towards the right path, and Daros and Castor give you a good cross-section of that. Sometimes enemies will recruit themselves, sometimes they won't. You might get hints from nearby houses or battle quotes, and not all enemies will be recruited by the same character. As for the chapter itself, it's alright. You're kind of encouraged to split, with your main force going left and a smaller force going up. Well, you're maybe not encouraged in the typical way I use that word. There's no real threatening anti-turtle here, it's just that you have so many player units that bunching up near all these choke points at the start just leads to characters getting in each other's way or sitting around doing nothing. Although, honestly, it might not be a bad idea to just hit end turn once, so that the enemies near the throne spread out a little more. I'm really not a fan of the enemy placement in this map. They're all clumped together near the throne, so you basically have no enemies to fight on turn 1 player phase, without going up and kicking the hornet's nest here. I think FE11 made a great change here by adding this pirate that you can attack on turn 1. It makes the map flow so much better. The main gimmick with this map is the large amount of river tiles makes the enemy pirates pretty slippery. Honestly, I found it a little more annoying than interesting because you can't tell how far the pirates can travel on the river, but that's more of a problem with FE1's dated user interface than the map idea itself. We'll see if they can execute this map's ideas better later on in the game. Chapter 3, A Brush in the Teeth. Honestly, I don't have a ton to say about this map. The map flow is very similar to Chapter 2. You want your main force going left and a smaller force going up. There is this little connector at the top of the map that connects the two branches, but there's not really much reason to use it. Also, much like Chapter 2, the enemies on this map just start way too far away for my liking. The enemy recruit this map is Navarre, and he kind of shows the weakness of FE1's looser approach to enemy recruits. The game doesn't really tell you anything about this guy, except that he's really scary, so you kind of have to guess which character recruits him, and even if you figure out he's recruitable to begin with, right? Really, he feels more like a tutorial on critical hits with his killing edge there, but I really don't like how easy he is to miss, especially given that he has story significance in the sequel. The only other really big thing Chapter 3 introduces is the Warp Staff. The Warp Staff is always crazy in these games, and the War of Shadows games has it in its most primitive and broken form. You bring your Warper next to your Warp target, and you can teleport that target to any traversable tile on the map. No range restriction, available very early, and with a ton of uses throughout the campaign, it's no surprise that I'm going to be banning the Warp Staff from my run. Warp almost always makes a chapter less interesting, and since I want to dive into the details of every map, it doesn't make any sense for me to use it, although I will mention the couple of times that it can make a map more interesting. That said, not a lot interesting about this map, so let's move on. Chapter 4, Battle in the Lee. Chapter 4 introduces us to battle preparations, and with it, the main reason I recommend players pick FE3 or FE11 over the original. I'm used to ROM hacks, which use the Game Boy Advance games as a base, so normally when I do battle preps, I have to care about 3 things. Which units am I deploying, where are they being deployed, and what items are they bringing? If you go later in the series, you have to make choices about more things, but when you go all the way back to the first entry, you only get to decide one thing. Which units are you bringing? This is really annoying for inventory management. If you got an enemy drop or visited an armory with a unit you weren't planning on using, you do need to physically bring them to the map so they can give their stuff out to units who want it. The fact that you can't adjust starting positions of your units is also kind of annoying, but only an actual issue in one map. Both FE3 and FE11 let you adjust your units' inventories and their starting positions. It feels a lot better. That said, this map also demonstrates why I chose FE1 as the target of my analysis instead of these two. FE11 adds significantly more options to the prep screen. You can buy things from a preps armory and trade around any items you have, but most importantly, you can change the class of almost any character you control. For this analysis, I want to take into account all the different ways you can play each map, but reclassing makes this kind of approach just impossible. The variance is just too big. I can't account for the player that hyper-invests into Sita's Wing Spear, the player that reclasses Sita to Mage, and every player in between. So even though most players in the West know the War of Shadows through FE11, I won't be covering that game. And although going by sales numbers, most players in Japan know the War of Shadows through FE3, I won't be covering that game either, since it straight up removes some FE1 maps to save space, and Chapter 4 is the first map removed. As for Chapter 4 of FE1, assuming no units in your party have died, you will be forced to bring exactly 14 units and bench exactly 3. You cannot choose to bring less than 14, even though at this early stage in the game, there might not be 14 units worth deploying. The map itself has another split where it encourages your main party to go left and a smaller force to go up. It does get kind of repetitive at this point, but honestly, this map pulls it off way better than the other two. A lot of what I find interesting about this map hinges on this village right here. This may sound weird if you've only played the FE11 version of this map, where this village is a very skippable 5,000 gold, while the real village you care about is here, because that's where you recruit Merrick. But here's the thing. In FE1, these two village rewards are switched. This adds a whole new dynamic to the map, making this third path that goes through this river very viable and very tempting. Thing is, only a few characters can actually cross river tiles, and they're all pretty bad against archers, which this map has a lot of. So now, you have these 3 prongs of your army cooperate, with the left and right sides taking pressure off the middle path so that this tiny little strike force can come in and recruit Merrick quickly. But why do you care about recruiting Merrick quickly? Well, that's because of this fucker here. He's probably the reason that these two villages got switched in the remake, because he's nasty. Unlike the thieves of the past 3 chapters that all mindlessly charge into your spears, this guy is on a mission. He's going to cross this river here, and if uninterrupted, is going to kill Merrick on turn 6. This means that even if you're taking the long path with Marth, where he sweeps left before coming up and going back right, you still really want to have a plan for dealing with this guy, and that's likely going to involve crossing this river here. This map really surprised me with how much I liked it. If you want to make a map with a tight anti-turtle and an organic party split where each side influences the others, take notes from this one. It really rewards players that pay attention to each character's movement and terrain data, And even though the anti-turtle is probably way too tight for an inexperienced player, I really fell in love with it. Last thing, this map does have the first arena in the series on it. For those who don't know, the old games have arenas where you can pay money and have one of your units enter combat, and if they win, they get experience and they get more money, so you can just do it infinitely. I'm not using the arena for the same reason I'm not using Warp, but I guess I should acknowledge its existence. Chapter 5, Champions of Aurelius. This is your first split deployment map in the series, although it may not seem like it at first. You're forced to deploy 10 units here, and when the map starts, 5 units from the Wolf Guard join you across the river. This sidesteps the issue of split deploys in FE1, since you can't decide which group your units are deployed in, and it also offers our first look into the Allied Army trope of the series. It's a really common scenario, both in vanilla entries and in ROM hacks, of the main protagonists coming into contact with a sizable chunk of characters that want to officially join the crew, but can't until the battle's over. Normally, in cases like these, the army joining you is in some immediate danger as a form of anti-turtle, and we will see that later, but here, that's not the case. Here, the developers want to portray Hardin and his forces as almost as competent as Marth's, but lacking the ability to win battles on their own. And I think they portray that really well here. You can see Hardin's forces are sectioned off by this mountain range, and only have a couple one-tile choke points as their main method of interaction with the enemy. So if you play defensively with them, enemies can't really threaten them, and if you go on the offense with them, like I did, it's pretty easy for them to muscle through the thieves and the archers that make up the enemy's first line of defense. But when the armor knights and the cavalry come in, their lack of any healing starts to become more noticeable, and it's unlikely that they would be able to push into the throne without casualties. Marth's party has things like the Rapier, the Armor Slayer, Merrick, and Wendell to really give this offensive the push that it needs to make it all the way. The flow of the map itself is mainly used to support this narrative, with Marth acting as a reinforcement to Hardin. Outside of that moment, there's not a whole lot else to talk about, but I did want to touch on 2 FE1 specific mechanics introduced in this map. The first is the double gate. There are 2 seize points in this map right next to each other. Both of them complete the chapter, but one is guarded by a boss who drops an item, and the other is guarded by a generic unit. This mechanic shows up a few times in this game, but never reappears again in the series, and it's easy to see why. I'm generally not a huge fan of FE1's boss design, but just sidestepping the boss and seizing the gate right next to him, while kind of funny the first time, doesn't really add any strategic depth and just makes the chapter feel anticlimactic more often than not. The other mechanic making its first appearance in this game is ambush spawns. Now, I know a lot of FE players and FE hackers have some very strong opinions on ambush spawns, but I'll table that discussion for later. In Chapter 5, you can actually finish the map before they ever get the chance to show up. But starting on turn 11, a Cavalier will spawn from this fort for a few turns, and on turn 13, a Pegasus Knight will spawn from this fort for a few turns. Both of these forts are very isolated from the main parts of the map, so they might draw the player's attention, but players are overall pretty unlikely to have units near the forts when reinforcements start spawning. If I were a game designer, and I wanted to introduce my player to the concept of ambush spawns in a safe environment, this is probably how I'd do it. Chapter 6, Fire Emblem. This is the first indoor map of the series, and indoor maps generally have a worse reputation than their outdoor counterparts. There's just not as much interesting terrain to interact with. I've seen hackers and SRPG creators who straight up refuse to have indoor maps without outdoor elements for that exact reason. And honestly, looking at this map, it's hard to blame them. There's this big, obnoxious 2-tile hallway that introduces the map, with armor knights to startle out your frontliners and archers to punish your squishy mages. The hallway that dominates the map layout is a total slog to push through. In FE11. Here, the map is pretty inoffensive and honestly kind of fun. The low enemy quality of FE1 really works in its favor here. The armor knights feel tough, but not invincible. You can bring out your silver weapons and take some pretty big chunks out of their health bar if you don't have a mage nearby. And you can see in my clear, I leaned pretty heavily on Marth's Provoke to distract the indirect attackers. Right, I haven't talked about this little AI quirk yet, so let's get it out of the way quickly. In FE1, Marth has a really high targeting priority. If an enemy can reach him, they will go for him pretty much no matter what. This was probably done so that the player would be more likely to protect Marth at all costs, kind of like the king in chess, but in reality it does the complete opposite. You can see here I put Sita in range of 2 archers, but because both of them can attack Marth instead, she's totally safe. It's a super exploitable mechanic, and it's no wonder they got rid of it after this game. I feel like I'm not totally crazy for seeing some of the DNA of Dragon's Gate here. Like, Dragon's Gate is my favorite map in FE7 because it combines tight one-tile choke points with very demanding anti-turtles and multiple pathways through the map. Chapter 6 doesn't quite have that last part, but the first 2 are definitely there. Honestly, the biggest letdown in this map is that they didn't program thieves to drop the items that they steal, so the Angelic Robe and the Killing Edge are almost impossible to get without warp. They did fix this in FE3, so I'm willing to call that version the definitive version of this map, despite the dismounting. But that said, the map flow here is still really fun, and it feels good to fight to secure all the chests that you can, so honestly, I'm gonna call this one a win for the indoor maps. Chapter 7, Lefkandeth Gauntlet. This is the map where the game tries to introduce the concept of ambush reinforcements to you. I say tries because wow, does this version pull its punches compared to FE11. In FE11, the reinforcements on this map are range-based, so once you go far enough south in the map, that's when they'll start spawning. This reinforces the story of the map, where the player is introduced to Minerva with the fact that she hates the dirty tricks that the general is trying to put her up to. When you see the ambush spawns, it becomes obvious that this was the trick she was alluding to. In the FE1 version, these reinforcements are turn-based. You will face 1 wave of 4 Cavaliers on turn 13 of this map. I'm a pretty fast player, I acknowledge that, but I wasn't using warp or anything, so I finished this map on turn 10. 10 and 13 might seem kind of close, but I think the difference here is bigger than it seems because this map just does not have a lot of tools to slow you down. Minerva and the White Wings do charge you on turn 1, but they turn around and retreat on turn 2. I can only assume that the developers wanted the scare tactic to be the thing that caused players to slow down enough for the reinforcements to be a real factor, because this map just does not have the tools to pressure you otherwise. Not counting Minerva and the White Wings, there are 9 enemies on this map who can both move and attack you. In my run, 7 of them were dead on turn 3. This just leads to a lot of dead turns in every playthrough, only exacerbated by this village here. This village has Bantu, a recruitable Manakete who seems to have the running gag in Arcanea of wasting my fucking time, because he always joins in a village that's super out of the way, and in this game, his only weapon is also in a village that's super out of the way. This map is where the fact that only Marth can visit villages becomes really intrusive, since now he needs to go down, then back up, then back down again to complete the map in a full recruitment playthrough. A lot of people just spend a warp here, because the map is just filled with boring turns of Marth just walking around. I think this map is a good lesson in the idea that you should have combat happening on every turn of the map in order to create a satisfying map flow. You'll see me complain about this game having boring turn 1s, but this map has the total opposite problem. All the interesting turns happen right at the start, and then it just falls apart down the stretch. Blocking forwards and straightening inventories are not interesting decisions. You could argue that the FE11 version of this map goes too far in the other direction, that it's too easy for the reinforcements to overwhelm the player and force a reset, but I think on the whole it's a much healthier approach than this one. Chapter 8, Port Warren. I've always really enjoyed the visual storytelling of Port Warren. For those who don't know, the story of this map is a bit of a sneak attack, as Marth chooses to attack this lightly guarded fortress in the east, rather than an unseen, heavily guarded one in the west. This detail about the place being lightly guarded isn't really spelled out until the remakes add a bit more meat to the story, But the seeds of that idea are all right here on the map itself. You can see all the enemies on this map are tucked away into what you can imagine are their barracks, and the boss of this map is even a wimpy armor knight compared to the more powerful generals of the past 2 maps. That said, this flavor does pretty noticeably come at the cost of gameplay. It's perhaps the most blatant example so far of what I'm going to call the Archerbias charge. Nothing happens on turn 1, a little bit happens on turn 2 player phase, and then everything happens on turn 2 enemy phase. This is anathema to map flow, especially in a game with combat as swingy as FE1's. The entire map is defined by this one big clash, where if you survive it, the map is pretty much over, and if you don't, you have to go back and probably do the same exact thing again, but hope for better RNG. And I know some of you might feel a little bit weird at me fixating on turn 2 in particular. After all, wouldn't a slower player experience this on turn 3? But I ask you to look at the bigger picture here. Every single generic enemy this chapter is set to charge immediately, so there are very few ways that this battle is capable of developing. It may not always happen on turn 2 precisely, but what's important here is that there's only going to be one point of conflict on the map, and that usually results in a pretty unpleasant play experience. FE11 handles this noticeably better. Only half the enemies on the map charge you down immediately, and the other half will use a group AI setting, where when you get into range of one of them, all of them start moving, but they're all stationary until you move into that first enemy's range. This is a notable improvement in how the map feels, since now there's 2 more staggered waves of enemies instead of just the one, but the map still isn't a real winner for me in that game either. Also, in FE1's defense, that level of enemy complexity probably wasn't possible in 1990. Chapter 9, Pyrothi Dragon. Chapter 9, on the other hand, is one of my favorite maps in the game. Take all the criticisms I had about Chapter 8 and turn them on their head. Much like Chapter 8, a lot of this map's action tends to happen on turn 2 enemy phase, but unlike Chapter 8, you have a lot of different ways you can approach turn 2 player phase in order to adapt to this fact. This is all because of my personal favorite generic enemy in the game, this Devil Axe Pirate. On turn 1, this hunter is going to move right here, and our friend is going to charge into this spot here. Now, I'm sure you're very tempted to jump on this archer's head on turn 2, but if you dive into one range of this hunter without thinking, you're now right in range of this guy's Devil Axe. And even if he doesn't one-shot you, you'll be low enough that this Blizzard Mage can finish the job. It's a situation that's so much more striking and complex than the cavalry charges that litter a lot of this game, and every player is going to approach this problem differently. And while Chapter 8 is very static from turn to turn, here the enemies are surprisingly dynamic. If you're a bit slower on the jump here, say your thief isn't close enough to the door to unlock it turn 1, suddenly the map looks very different to you. The Devil Axe Pirate goes from peeking around this corner of the river here to completely dominating the island this battle is going to take place on. Now he's more threatening, but he's also more vulnerable to swoop in and kill, and since he's not as well protected by his Blizzard buddy, it's slightly easier to tank a hit from him. Now, of course, he does have supportive partners besides the Blizzard Mage, but as you're seeing in my footage, there are workarounds for this. There are 3 pirates who are willing to help out this Devil Axe guy, but they all start right below a big body of water, so you can lure them away from the main battlefield with the ever-helpful Sita, or with, surprise returning guest, Daros. Once again, Daros' water-walking capabilities really turn a map into a winner for me. By baiting these guys into the water, you keep them from reinforcing the enemies that are actually likely to kill you, and split these guys up so they're fighting 2 battles at once. This brings me to my next point, that pirates are actually really fun to fight in FE1. The things about FE1 combat that are really annoying, and mid-game they start to be more pronounced, is enemy speed and crit. Using the Horsemen last map as an example, their high speed and the low weapon weight of the bowgun combined with the very low doubling threshold in this game, means that they double a lot of your otherwise very reliable party members. At this stage of the game, a lot of your stronger weapons, like the Steel Sword and the Silver Lance, have a pretty decent chance to miss. So, if you miss your 80% chance to kill a horseman, on enemy phase he can turn around and hit you for 2 damage twice, or, because the bowgun has innate crit, he can double crit and hit you for 6 damage twice. There's no way to lower enemy crit rate in FE1, luck doesn't do that, so you just have to eat the crit chance. So, moving forward, when I call combat in this game swingy, that's what I mean. That said, thankfully, the pirates in this map sidestep these flaws by having very low skill and being weighed down by their heavy axes. So the chances that you'll totally whiff what should be an easy kill and just get blown up on the crackback are thankfully very low. They do get a lot of avoid from being on sea tiles, so you do have to account for some RNG when facing them at sea, but that brings me to the other reason that they're fun to fight, their movement. FE1, to no one's surprise, has some pretty basic AI settings. It's a little more advanced than you'd think, what with all the heal AI and whatnot, but it's still a lot of charge AI that defines how these maps play. As we saw in Chapter 8, this can, and frequently does, result in the entire enemy force being slammed into you at once, especially if you take on these maps more aggressively. But these pirates, with their limited movement over the water, really stagger their advance despite the fact that they all have charge AI. You can actually see the best example of this back in Chapter 1, with these 3 guys coming at you across the top of the map. It increases the time it takes for them to reach you, and that's a huge reason for why I think that map flows so well. And we see some of that again here. I also think that I'm really big on this battle because I'm playing fast, and doing that here means Marth is nowhere near this battle, so you can't just use his provoke cheese here. But unfortunately, that does mean Marth exposes the weakness of this map, which is everything outside of this battle. It's not a huge issue, I find, but the area of the map that has George's village and everything south of it is incredibly barren. I do like the anti-turtle of this thief that can hit the village on turn 3, combined with this pirate that provides cover for him, so Marth on his own usually isn't enough to secure this village, but after that, the whole right side is just totally empty. It's actually faster once Marth recruits George to go back to the left instead of sweeping down, but I do like the vibe of Marth, George, and Marth's bodyguard taking the scenic route through the map. The reason I don't think Marth's morning jog really hurts this map that much compared to, say, Chapter 7, is that the left side is still doing stuff this whole time, so there will still be combat happening every turn, and it's never just him waddling to the throne. The only really big casualty of this map being super empty is the Wormslayer chest. I don't know why they felt the need to put it super out of the way of everything. Maybe it's to make it feel more special and important as a way to kill this unstoppable boss. Thing is, this boss is actually very stoppable, so thankfully this chest is very skippable. They make a thief go after this chest in FE11, and as far as I'm concerned, he can keep it. This is the second map cut from FE3. I kinda see why they did it, because story-wise this map is basically filler, but I think it's a shame because this map is really fun. Chapter 10, Princess Minerva. Princess Minerva is another real highlight of this game for me, thanks to its super ambitious map structure. Basically, the entire map is built around the side objective here, rather than the main one. If all you care about is getting to the throne, there's this really open, lightly guarded path going around the prison. You can just go for it. But of course, the map expects you to break into the prison and bust Maria out of there. And there are 2 ways to do it, going in through the front door or using the warp staff. I'll admit it, when I said I would talk about the warp staff improving maps, this is the map I meant. Warping Marth into Maria's prison cell is an iconic part of the War of Shadows. Everyone does it. It's easily my favorite warp use in the series, and in FE1 it introduces a lot of challenges, namely with inventory management. I've kept quiet about FE1's inventory system, but it takes quite a bit of getting used to. As I said before, you can't adjust your items in preps, But once you're on the map, the only way to adjust your inventory between characters is to have one character give an item to the other. You can't take items, and giving an item does end your unit's turn, but at least you can give multiple items away in the same action. This is obviously a really dated inventory system, and another one of the big reasons I encourage people to play one of the remakes instead. But honestly, at this point in my playthrough, I had kind of gotten used to it. I thought it was kind of satisfying to plan out my inventories in advance, since I knew all the maps ahead of time, and Chapter 10 was one of the big payoffs for that. I knew that if I wanted to pull off the warp strat, I should give Marth 2 door keys so I don't have to warp a thief with him, and so I came up with a plan to give him 1 door key apiece in Chapters 8 and 9, and executed it without slowing down my playthrough to accommodate it. The inventory system is really at its clunkiest when you're inexperienced and fumbling around at the end of each map trying to organize your stuff, but when you work it into your already existing moves, it's surprisingly kind of cool. That said, I did forget to give Marth a strong sword to deal with the guy guarding the back door, so new problem. I can address this hero situation in one of 2 ways. Either I can warp my best combat unit in there to act as a bodyguard, or I can walk around the back side here and pincer the guy. Any of you who have played FE11 were probably waiting for me to mention this, but a huge difference between the FE1 and 3 versions of this map and the FE11 version is that the FE11 version starts you way further forward. You might be expecting me to say this further back position kills the map flow, where is my instant action? But honestly, it's not bad. Starting this far back means that the wyverns here are going to charge you from behind instead of going down the left side. And that means once again you're probably going to be seeing combat on turn 2 enemy phase. And I gotta say, these 2 wyverns were excellent enemy choices. The last time you fought wyverns was back in Chapter 7, where it looked like you were going to fight 2, but then Minerva turns around and dips. And while that one wyvern was the single scariest enemy on the map, if you could lure her in range of Merrick or an archer, she was a sitting duck. That's not the case when you have 2 of them backing each other up. You can see the most obvious candidate to encounter them, Sita, can barely land a scratch on them. They're very intimidating, despite having dinky iron weapons, so it really builds your anticipation for finally having one of these gals on your team. And with the thief threatening the treasure to the south, and these wyverns breathing down your neck from the north, it makes a lot of logical sense to split here, with your horses going down and your foot units staying near the start. It's here you might notice that some of your foot units can climb these cliff tiles, although I say might because I didn't notice it. I had to get my ass beat on the warp strat, retry using the warpless strat, then only at the very end of my warpless strat did I notice it. These do not look like traversable tiles. I wish they had a random foot unit on this map walk across some so you could see that they are, but I digress. Once I figured this out, this became the other solution to a Marth that can't 1v1 this hero. Then, after that, the map flows pretty well, with Marth recruiting Minerva and striding to the throne, while your mounted squad gathers up the rest of the map's treasure. But that's with warp, and I said this would be a warpless run, so what does the map look like there? Honestly, it's not terrible, but I definitely prefer the warp version. It reminds me a lot of Kaga's later work, honestly. If you've played like Vistaria Saga or any of the other games Kaga spearheaded after leaving Intelligent Systems, this map flow will look very familiar to you. Lots of low tension turns where you deal with chump generics, punctuated by high tension turns with scary one-off enemies. The 2 wyverns, the hero, and the sniper squad are the big set pieces of the map, which took me 17 turns warpless. Despite the high turn count, the map takes a while to run out of gas. These Pegasus Knights and Cavaliers are unpredictable in a way that's honestly pretty engaging. Especially if you're using Sita in the north here. It's a bit of a push and pull with if they're going to overcommit to chasing her down or go back around to attack Marth's squad. Honestly, it only started to drag after the hero was dead, because Minerva was way out of position to be recruited, and the boss is pretty impenetrable without the Levin Sword. Thankfully, Minerva joins with the Levin Sword in her starting inventory, so she's an obvious candidate for the boss kill. The chapter is really set up so cleanly to make her look badass, it really reminds me of like Four Kings or something. Like, Minerva is such a slam dunk of a unit to kill this boss with, and he even drops a Speed Wing, which fixes her only bad stat. Giving her this guy's Speed Ring to bring her up from 6 speed to 12 speed was such a no-brainer in FE1 that in FE3 they just changed her base speed to 12 to acknowledge that, yeah, everyone did this. One last thing before we move on. Knowing what I know now, it's definitely faster to have Marth go around the back door and rescue Maria from there for a warpless strategy, but I'm not about to spend 17 turns on a clear and not talk about it. That said, my warpless clear took so long that it was the first time I ran into ambush spawns in FE1. And here I was about to compliment this game for its clear signposting of reinforcement zones. Chapters 5, 7, 8, and 9 all have ambush spawns, and they're all clearly marked by fort tiles. But of course, the one time I actually run into ambush spawns, they just pop out of the middle of nowhere. And I even had my foot units at the spawn point of the map. Yeah, fuck these guys. Chapter 11, Norda Market. Alright, I think it's time to talk about Sita. Kaga has said in interviews that, especially early on, this series was meant to be Iron Manned, but Sita kinda contradicts that, right? She's not that useful in this map, honestly, but I'm still deploying her because she recruits a unit here. For those keeping track at home, this will be the 4th unit that only she can recruit, and she'll recruit a 5th one before this run is over. This is unheard of outside of the War of Shadows games. In every other vanilla entry, and in most ROM hacks that I've seen, the Lord is the only character who consistently recruits red units. If a side character recruits a red unit, it's usually a one-time thing for a plot-important reason. The willingness of developers to give a side character this many exclusive enemy recruitment combos is entirely unique to Sita. Even in FE6, a game that takes heavy inspiration from FE1, their Sita stand-in, Lilina, only recruits 2 characters. And while most mechanics that only appear in FE1 deserved to be abandoned, I think this one had potential. It's clearly a compromise that they made back before they had plot-relevant characters retreat instead of die, so while Sita couldn't ever appear in main story cutscenes, they still wanted her to remain a factor in the player's mind, and I think they really succeeded at this. Sita really gets her time to shine in quite a few maps. People that don't like Pegasus Knights may not like it, but I love using her, so I think it's a huge strength that she's almost impossible to bench for the first half of the game. Her flight has given her some really cool utility in the past couple maps, and her unique stat line of low strength and high weapon level gives her a playstyle that's just plain more interesting than most FE1 units, which I really appreciate. If you want to make a unit important to the story that the player is going to be deploying a lot, you should be making them both useful and fun to use, and I think they nailed it here. As for the map itself, I mean, look at it. It looks like 2 regular size maps that got stapled together. You already know what I'm going to say about the pacing, so I'm not even going to say it. What I will say is that this map has some of the strongest enemy design that I've seen so far. I love the flavor of the enemy placement, where the knights are over protecting the castle while the town just has mercenaries, and it plays off of the tools the player has beautifully, namely the recently gained Minerva. Your first instinct might be to send her up towards the throne, but there's this horseman here that's boxing her out of making real progress. While she could probably overcome him if she had a solid inventory, in my opinion her time is better spent going right. These mercenaries are fast and have high crit rates, but their below average attack means their swords just bounce off Minerva's scales. They won't attack her on enemy phase, but she can still chip them down safely for your main force to clean up in a few turns. After that, she can fly back up to the top left where the real action of this map is happening. The main crux of this section of the map is the sniper and this mannequin, both of which are mobile and have pretty heavy range overlap. So you've got to thread this needle here of luring out and killing the sniper without getting killed on the follow-up by the mannequin. The Cavaliers and the Horsemen aren't that threatening, but they don't need to be. They're here to clog your path with bodies so you can't get a clean hit in on the sniper. Even the Ballisticians, a class that's generally underwhelming in this game, get to make a really strong first impression here. This guy introduces you to this section of the map, and his sky-high defense forces players to respect him. He's basically guaranteed to get some chip in with his Thunderbolt, while luring the player into the sniper's range. So, yeah, a lot to like about this map if you can ignore Marth taking one of the longest virgin walks of his life. Chapter 12, The Ageless Palace. The indoor maps are back, baby, and this one introduces one of my favorite anti-turtles in Fire Emblem. Midia's squad begins the map trapped in this prison cell, and she explains that once the map starts, the enemies nearby will try to kill them. There aren't enough safe positions in the prison cell for all 5 of them, so you better move fast if you don't want them to die. I love anti-turtles like these. There's nothing wrong with a thief going after a village or a chest, but finding something unique like this adds a lot of flavor to a map. However, once Midia's squad is secured around turn 3 or 4, the map kinda takes a nosedive. You really want to send Marth through the treasure room since he can open chests, but it's really not a fun part of the map to go through. This section of the map is filled with tons of tight corridors, and unlike Chapter 11, where it felt like you were wrenching open the enemy's front lines to get at the exposed interior, here it's just one tight corner after another. You do feel a little bit like you're constricting around the enemy, like your offense is a slow march towards the inevitable, but honestly that doesn't make for very fun gameplay. Combat is clunky, and missing an 80 doesn't mean you can bring in another unit to finish the job instead. It means that the enemy is just going to flail around uselessly for another turn, blocking your progress. Anyone who's played this map knows that beyond the boss room, there's an additional optional room with another boss, and in a chest, a pair of boots. I think that this is a pretty cool setup, although other LTCers might disagree with me. It sets up the boots as an even cooler, much more important reward than the rest of the items in the treasure room, and it offers you a clear trade-off for going for it. The extra enemies here also make the boots chest a lot more fulfilling to get, something the Wormslayer chest back in Chapter 9 was really missing. I will say, having one map with a ton of chests does expose just how clunky FE1's inventory system is, but thankfully the devs also put a supply tent in this courtyard, so you don't have to deploy Rickard for more maps than necessary. Chapter 13, The Wooden Cavalry. Yeah, there's not much to say about this map. Chapter 13 is composed almost entirely of ballisticians. If you didn't know, ballisticians in most Fire Emblem games have high attack range to make up for their poor stats and mobility. But here in FE1 they only have 2 range. While they do have high defense that makes them hard to one-round, as you saw in Chapter 11, they really rely on complementing other classes to make up for the fact that they themselves have very exploitable weaknesses. When it's all ballisticians, you can just kind of spam magic weapons until you win. You can even ignore the top and bottom rows of this map if you want. If you run away, the ballisticians don't have enough movement to chase you. At least this is a bit of a breather map, which gives you the chance to fix up your inventories and get your good weapons off your bench fodder, which is nice. I was playing Dark Lord and Maiden of Light the other day, and in that game there's this joke unit who's a 4-move armor knight with only swords and bows, and if you deploy her long enough, she makes a comment to you about how you should have benched her. Remove her ability to use swords, and you basically have Jake and Beck in this game. This map was cut from FE3, not hard to see why. Chapter 14, Land of Sorrow. I'll be honest, I don't really know what this map is going for. I think FE1 in general really struggles to have maps that feel climactic, because the boss here is a character that is important to the story. He's the guy that betrayed Marth's father, leading to his death, but the map around him is completely all over the place. Marth is being pulled this way, past this firing line of archers towards the village, but there's not really a clean way to clear out this nest, so you're kind of encouraged to ignore it and push down these 2 paths. There's no real incentive to go fast. Enemy thieves can't open doors in FE1, so they can't really steal this treasure from you. This map also introduces the mechanic of drawbridges, a weird tile type that will appear exactly 1 more time in the whole game. Sure, why not? I think if we cut this map into 3 pathways, representing the path to the village and the 2 main paths to the throne, the issue here starts to become more apparent. This middle column is completely devoid of enemies, and From this column, you can easily pressure the other two paths, but enemies from those paths can't really do the reverse. Another reason I think this map fails to really pressure the player is due to technical limitations. It seems they could only load a maximum of 20 enemy units at a time, which explains the large barren sections of a lot of these maps, and I think Chapter 14 is the biggest casualty of that fact. Both FE3 and FE11 bump up the enemy count this map, and that's a change I definitely approve of, along with allowing enemy thieves to open doors. FE3 even goes so far as to change the map layout here, to try and coerce the player into a harsher split, which I really like. This map does follow up on the design idea of Chapter 12 and the Boots chest, with this treasure area guarded by a sniper. I don't like the execution here quite as much as I did in that map, but I still really appreciate that the game is building on its own ideas, and that if you want to get every single goodie in the map, Julian by himself is not going to cut it. That said, I still think the map is still too flawed conceptually to really pull a winner out of it just by adding enemies. The Archer Nest is just not fun to interact with, and if you choose not to interact with, then the main set piece of the map just falls completely flat. Looks like the indoor maps couldn't pull a winner out of this one. We're 1-1. Also, just a side note, this is the map where the first White Wings, Pulla and Catria, will join you. The White Wings are fan favorites from this game, but I actually wanted to point them out because in FE1, they don't join you if Minerva is dead or unrecruited. It's a nice flavor touch in theory, but locking out 4 of your 5 flyers is way too harsh of a punishment for a Minerva dying. If I was Iron Manning this game and I knew about this cost, I honestly might be too scared to deploy Minerva, one of the best units in the game. This condition was removed from the remakes. You can always recruit the White Wings here, and I think that makes a lot more sense. Chapter 15, An Oasis of Magic. We're here at the very first desert map in Fire Emblem history. Desert maps are one of the more hated map types in the series. Again, like indoor maps, I have seen developers and hackers that refuse to make desert maps. In fact, one of my favorite hacks, Shackled Power, lists a lack of desert maps as one of its big selling points. Players typically hate 2 things about desert maps. Unless you're a mage or a flyer, moving through the sand is super sluggish, and the maps are also usually full of hidden treasure to try and convince you to buy the game's guidebook. Thankfully, that second issue won't be a factor in this map. There's no hidden treasure here. But how about the first one? Well, as you might be able to tell, you don't actually have to deal with desert terrain all that much in this map. There's this big green ring encircling the map, and the start area and the seize point are connected by this ring, so Marth's main path is almost completely unobstructed. However, that's not to say that desert terrain is irrelevant here. The enemies are certainly going to be using it to their advantage. This is one of the most difficult maps in the game, bar none. Mages aren't a fast class, but tomes have almost no weight, so their speed is a bit deceptive. If you're equipping a lance, you're probably getting doubled. This is scary, because unlike most maps where you can rush down enemy mages with your cavalry, here the desert terrain means they outrange you, and they really control the battlefield here. They've also got Draconites backing them up, which don't have quite the firepower of mages, but complement them with an even higher threat range. Frankly, the enemies in this map are horrifying. In the footage, you'll see me using silver swords on these enemy mages, when iron or steel might have done the trick, and that's because playing around a missed 1 round is so much more difficult in this map, where the sand might keep you from following up with a partner. Easily, the most dangerous enemy on this map is the Bishop, who backs up his low tome weight with a speed stat that's crazy high. Lord help you if you lost the barrier staff. Thankfully, the other 2 bishops on this map weigh themselves down heavily, and that brings us to our primary story beat of this map, Garneth. Garneth has always been a real highlight of this game's enemies for me. I love how the game teaches you his personality through the map itself. You can tell he's a very arrogant guy who doesn't genuinely see Marth's forces as a threat, and in this map, he's able to back that up. His Imhulu tome makes him immune to all damage, so he's completely untouchable. That said, you can still get one over on him by luring him away from the chest room and grabbing the loot while he's distracted. This is a nice twist on the chest room guards we saw in chapters 12 and 14. I think I do prefer his interpretation in the 2 remakes, where he more actively taunts you by charging you down before getting bored and leaving, but given that the FE1 version of this map might genuinely be the most difficult version, I think I'm still okay with their interpretation here. And even outside of Garnath, I think this map is a slam dunk from a flavor perspective. The fact that every enemy on the map, besides this thief, is completely unaffected by desert terrain was probably a concession to the fact that you can't check enemy ranges in this game, but the fact that the enemy armory is 90% mages gives the city of Kadine a super distinct feel from the rest of Arcanea, and An Oasis of Magic was the perfect chapter title for this map. I do like that when you revisit Kadine in the sequel story, The War of Heroes, there's a full village in the top right corner, where there used to be just a fort, filling out more of this map space with more things to do. Also, this is the first chapter in the game where you don't recruit any new party members. FE1 is absolutely filled to the brim with playable characters, so their absence here feels very purposeful, to really highlight the desolation of the desert sands. Chapter 16, The Battle for Altia. Honestly, this one surprised me a bit. I fully expected to hate this one. Marth has his biggest virgin walk yet, as he has to circle the globe to recruit both a character from one of the villages and Zane. Giving Marth the boots definitely made a huge difference here. I finished the map in 12 turns, which definitely seems faster than the developers intended, but if Marth only had 7 movement rather than the 11 he has here, I can totally see this map being filled with tons of empty turns. That said, there were hardly any empty turns in the way that I played it. Even turn 1 of this map is a lot more active than the other turn 1s of this game, since you need to be ready to intercept 3 Draconites. After the Draconites are dealt with, the map largely revolves around this squad of 10 mounted units. Like in Chapter 10, these enemies can pick between this long, flat path or this short, terrain-heavy path to attack you, and you can influence which paths they each take. It's not a new idea in this game, but I think it's a really fun one. I like when the map responds dynamically to how you choose to approach it. I ended with an 8-2 split, with 2 horses chasing after Marth and the new recruit Aaron, and 8 staying in the starting area to fight the mages and Minerva. Honestly, I probably respected the horsemen way too much here. Minerva can probably solo all 10 of these guys. She's insane. She just combines Sita with Jagan and has better stats than both of them. That said, with all the ways the cavalry can split here, everyone's going to have a different experience with this map, and I can at least say that the 8-2 split is pretty fun. What's not fun is recruiting the other unit on this map, Zane. This could have been the perfect time for Sita or someone else to step in, but unfortunately, only Marth can visit the village on the left, and only Marth can talk to Zane on the right. Zane will walk up to Marth and recruit himself, which does cut down on the walking a little bit, but he still really does not feel good to recruit. It's not obvious that he wants to recruit himself. He won't move when the doors to his cell are locked, and when you unlock the doors and jam them up with blue units, he won't move then either. I think a lot of players don't even know he recruits himself, which kind of defeats the point. However, it does tie into my point that the developers intended this map to be way longer than just 12 turns, which I already regard as a little sluggish. A lot of hackers I talk to like to call 10 turns as kind of the ceiling of acceptable, and of course, me being me, I try and work them down from there. You're free to disagree, of course, but look at what this map is trying to get you to do. There's this huge plaza right at the very bottom of the map with all these shops and stuff. Normally, for slower maps like this, my less important units can kind of fumble around and fix inventories. But they can't do that on this map because the only supply tile is all the way down there. Yeah, no wonder I said I was surprised at how I didn't hate this map. You look at this thing and you start thinking, I'm going to be playing this map for like 2 hours. You know, what's really crazy is that this is actually the fastest version of this map, because both of the remakes remove Marth's ability to cross the water here. Yeah, thankfully for my sanity, this experiment was a failure, and another failed experiment, double C's points, really saved my ass here, because mages can't cross rivers, and I did not want to deal with this boss's killing edge. Chapter 17, Star and Savior. Like how Chapter 16 reiterates on Chapter 10's unique cavalry charge gimmick, Chapter 17 reiterates on Chapter 10's idea of a map centered around its side objective. You look at the map, and there are hardly any enemies actually guarding the throne on the right. They're all on the left, protecting the chests. You could easily finish this map in about 3 turns, but in the interest of exploring the whole map, I did go for the chests, adding on another 6 turns to my clear. The anti-turtle here is surprisingly tough. These thieves are really slippery. You can see here, I tried a pretty straightforward frontal assault, and I got totally stalled out in this choke point. You can try and pincer them a bit by going up and around this middle hallway, but the Manicheets are really strong enemies, so that path isn't without its risks either. And again, thieves do not drop chest items in this game, so I lost 3 chest rewards and almost lost a 4th. Thankfully, the 3 chests I did get are the ones that I cared about the most, but if you want the warp staff on this map, you're in for a bit of a fight. Speaking of a fight, I bet they figured they could leave the throne lightly guarded because this boss is a real prick. He's the player's introduction to the Mage Stone, or Demon Stone as it's called in this translation. It negates magic, so the tried and true method of hitting the Excalibur button doesn't work on this guy. You need to actually use the Wormslayer, or you're going to be stuck dealing with him for a long time. The only resource you get on this map that can deal with this guy is the Devil Sword out of a chest, which obviously has its own drawbacks even if you do manage to grab it before those thieves. Now, I obviously had the foreknowledge of how the Mage Stone works, so I could dispatch of him pretty easily, but honestly, I kinda like this guy. It's Chapter 17, you should know how Manicheets work and you have the resources to deal with them. Here's a big bad dude that's even tougher than all the other Manicheets, sitting right on Marth's throne. You should know how to deal with him, go prove it. And if you can't prove it, if he's stalling you out, then you'll have these reinforcements from the right to deal with while you chip him down. Honestly, I like a lot of the ideas this map is selling me. And FE1 combat aside, I did have my fun with it. But something about it just isn't quite clicking. I think it's that the map just is not visually interesting. Compare it to Chapter 10, where there's this sharp visual divide between the simple main path and the complex side objective. Here, we're really lacking that clarity. Hell, even in Chapter 16, when it's done taking you around the world, has this cute little town that just spices up the map. And even though I never visited it, I remember it. This map is just a castle with 2 wings. The boss has no build up to it, you just unlock his door and walk right in there. Really, the biggest lesson I'm pulling out of this map is that aesthetics matter. Even though this is an NES game, and the graphics aren't pretty, a lot of these maps have been able to sell me on their vibes through their aesthetics. And unfortunately, in that aspect, Chapter 17 just falls flat. One final thing before we move on. I thought I was done explaining FE1 mechanics, but this map introduces secret shops. I think their introduction here is pretty cool. You have this house outside explaining what they are, and this priest guy drops a member card. That said, I'm not going to visit any. I could say it's to replicate the blind player or whatever, but really I just don't feel like it. That said, one shop that is worth visiting on this map is the regular shop at the castle entrance, as that is the last spot before the final map that you can buy door keys. This will be important later. Chapter 18, the Sable Order. This is the 4th map cut from FE3, and yeah, I'm not really going to argue this one. You survive a couple cavalry charges and you win the map, an Archerbias classic. Marth's provoke skill is really good here. You can probably use this map to train up for his showdown with Madius, but he'll have plenty of other chances later. This map is also the most likely to show the player that the Rider's Bane only works on unpromoted cavaliers in this game, not horsemen or paladins, which is like, kinda funny. Chapter 19. Manicheet Princess. Chapter 19 actually gives us a break from the more vague or obtuse enemy recruitments in this game to give us something more similar to what we'd see in later entries. They tell you right in the map start event, Bantu is important to the little girl sitting on the throne. I can only assume they did this because Tiki is the only recruitable boss in the entire game. At least with Navarre, you have some small clue that maybe the developers would want you to do something with this totally unique enemy who has a portrait and a name, but you already expect bosses to have that. And since Tiki's the boss, she's one of the last enemies you fight, so containing her hint to the battle quote would have really sucked if you didn't deploy Bantu. So yeah, of all the times to bust out the very clear signposting, this was a really good one. And hell, Bantu's pretty fun to use on this map too. I haven't used him much because of his low movement. If he starts the map in a bad position, he just never gets to do anything. But here, a unit with really overkill defense like Bantu is a great answer for the heroes on this map. They have high speed and crit. He's not a total slam dunk here. He's still vulnerable to the mages and snipers, but you should know how to play around those by now. And you know, I say that, but honestly, I kinda played this map like shit. I was too overeager with my paladins. There's no real anti-turtle this map since enemy thieves can't open doors, and I was already gonna wait around while I grabbed all this treasure anyway, so there really wasn't any reason to go much faster than Bantu's walking speed. I was taking a lot of unnecessary risks for no real benefit. Actually, I was pretty surprised to find out this map had no anti-turtle, since there are 3 thieves in this map, and those are usually a good sign of one. But I guess the developers realized that if an enemy thief gets the Star Sphere, it's gone for good, and the final boss basically becomes unbeatable. Putting time pressure in here might have been inappropriate. Or maybe they just hit the deadline to release the game before they could teach enemy thieves how to open doors. Who really knows? Actually, I guess while I'm here, I might as well try and justify what makes for a good or bad anti-turtle in Fire Emblem. I think anyone who isn't a serial arena grinder kind of intuitively gets why anti-turtles in general are good, but that's just my assumption, and I don't want any of my assumptions to go unchallenged. I like anti-turtles as a form of skill expression, like how a platformer might reward you for clearing a tougher obstacle course by giving you an extra life or something. I like when the game acknowledges that you are getting better at it. There is a second type of anti-turtle, one you'll see more commonly in ROM hacks, where the primary goal of it isn't really to reward skill expression, but to create tension. This type of anti-turtle didn't appear in the series until FE3 with Astrum, and has appeared sporadically in the mainline games ever since then. It's the type of anti-turtle that requires all players to pass the skill check, otherwise they get a game over. And since doing that gets rid of the main reason I like anti-turtles, I tend to be more critical of these types. I think the game creator needs to put in more legwork in the game narratively to make these kinds of anti-turtles actually satisfying. But for FE1, I'm more than satisfied with the reasoning of thieves want treasure. That said, Chapter 19 uses its thieves in a more unique way. Like I briefly touched on before, the reason Marth is here is to gather the Light Sphere and the Star Sphere. But as you enter the map, you see that one of these chests has already been picked. Because FE1 doesn't let you see which enemies drop items, you need to piece together what happened to the Light Sphere. And once you figure out this Devil Sword thief is the culprit, you need to rip it from his grasp without getting torn apart on the counterattack. It's a cute puzzle, and as for the map leading up to it, it's alright. You know I'm not a huge fan of these more claustrophobic maps, but you can do some cool stuff here, like lure these mages to attack you over the walls. So you're like disarming this trap and you never need to fight a mage and a hero at the same time. The map is also pretty short, so the gimmick never really overstays its welcome. Chapter 20. Camus the Sable. Yeah, this map kinda blows. I think at this point we're pretty firmly in the late game of Fire Emblem 1, and late games tend to have a pretty bad reputation in this series. One of my hopes with this video is that we can unravel something about this stigma, see if there are any factors in here that might shed some light on why late games are so consistently reviled. We can divide Chapter 20 into 3 distinct phases. The first phase is defined by, you guessed it, a cavalry charge. But unlike the previous maps, these guys are Silver Sword Paladins. This is the only map in the game where Paladins are given silver swords, which are lighter and more accurate than silver lances, and you can really tell. These guys are strong, fast, and bulky. They can cleave huge chunks out of the HP of a lot of good units, and with a crit, they can one-shot just about anyone. So while your tools for handling a cavalry charge haven't really changed all that much from Chapter 16, here, Marth or Minerva can just randomly explode from this huge spike in enemy quality. Throughout both Phase 1 and Phase 2 of this map are enemy ballisticians, and honestly, this map is a pretty good send-off to them, although they will also appear in the final map. Here, they function as a really good complement to the melee attackers of this map. Their high defense means you really need to focus them down to deal with them, but how much you care about them depends on your team composition, specifically how active you want your flyers to be. You know I love Minerva, so the aerospace guys are a big deal to me, but the Hoist Flame guys, not so much. Phase 2 has you dealing with more Valisticians, this time paired with Generals, which are much more manageable. You've got 2 squads, one over the river here, and another past the forests. The guys beyond the forests actually provide an interesting challenge unique to FE1. Since you can't see enemy ranges, you need to calculate how far each of them can move through the forest manually to make sure you're not accidentally luring too many red units with one blue unit. Since it's only 3 low movement guys, I don't think it's too mentally taxing, but given how many times I had to reset from Phase 1, I personally felt more stressed than engaged at this point in my run, which brings us to Camus himself in Phase 3. Phase 3 is your boss battle and dealing with any reinforcements. Right, yeah, FE11 changed this map so that Camus was an optional boss, and the guy on the throne was a recruitable enemy. But in the original and FE3 versions, you gotta kill this bastard. You know, apparently this game's manual has data on all the weapons in this game. Well, it might. I checked it out and I couldn't find any data on the Gradivis. I can't read Japanese, so I may have missed it, but this is relevant because you can't actually view weapon stats in this game. This isn't actually a big deal most of the time. If you're a Fire Emblem fan, you already pretty much know how all the weapons work and you can kind of vibe it out, but not Gradivis. Gradivis has a 1-2 range and 20 might. This dude can one-shot your bishops from full health, and it only has 4 weight. He's not even slow. Yeah, I had Serenus Forest open the whole time when I was fighting this guy, and I am not ashamed of it. Hell, I even used save states when fighting this guy. I did not want to go back to Phase 1. And that fear definitely informed my approach to the reinforcements here. There aren't actually that many of them, only 9 according to the .org wiki, but I was horrified of these dudes and how many fortify uses they might force me to spend. So I stuck with the devil I know over the devil I don't, and made some risky plays to kill Camus before they could reach me. Honestly, it's kind of a cool setup. Reinforcements encircling you while you're chipping away at this impenetrable boss. But just like Phase 2, a lot of those nuances were lost on me while I was actually playing the map, because the map had just burnt up all of its goodwill, and that might be one of those keys that we're looking for. Granted, a lot of what makes this map frustrating is just NES stuff, how FE1 doesn't tell you a lot of the information you would need to make informed decisions, but beyond that, this map just wears you out. It sucks all of the joy out of what are some honestly cool ideas. Crazy that they could manage to do that with only 20 enemies, but that is absolutely a criticism I could see applying to other late games in the series. Let's keep a lookout for this one, see if it pops up again later. Chapter 21, Clash in Macedon. Yeah, this map was cut from FE3, and honestly, if I cut it from this video, most of you wouldn't have noticed. Actually, I do need to credit Chapter 21 for helping to inspire the format of this video. The idea for me to review every map in FE1 actually comes from a friend of the channel, Klaire Fluffle, who several years ago now made her own map analysis of FE1. But she decided to do one video per map, rather than cramming them all together like I am. And the whole time I was watching that series, I was like, shit, how would you even do Chapter 21? That's such a nothing map, I wouldn't be able to talk about it for even like 30 seconds. Unfortunately, Klaire's series never made it to Chapter 21. I think she made it to Chapter 4. Also, that series is deleted now, but it did inspire me to make this video, so I have to give props there. And speaking of Fire Emblem YouTubers, it's at about this point in my script that I saw MythrilZenith start to upload his own series of videos analyzing the maps from the War of Shadows. I had no idea he was doing this. We both thought of doing this video idea independently, but if you just haven't had enough map analysis after listening to me for like an hour, really? I mean, he's got you covered. Yeah. I'll be linking Klaire's channel and Mithril's in the description. Anyway, yeah, if you live past turn 2 in this map, you just win. You just go up. It's such a basic map. They call him the Pebble. Chapter 22, A Night-Filled Sky. Chapter 22 is defined by, you guessed it, an Arcanea charge. Yeah, bet you thought I wasn't bringing that term back. No, really, it is just a big fuck-off charge that is usually resolved on turn 2 enemy phase. Either you die on that turn, or you don't, and the map is pretty much over. Honestly, it's at this point in the run that I kinda question the developer's intent on giving Marth Provoke. The fact that it makes the player play very aggressively with Marth seems almost intended now, with how quickly I'm able to scale up Marth's level. He must have gotten like 10 levels in just chapters 21 and 22, and with the Mercurius that he got off Est, having really high stats and improving his level ups, he can just shred through these enemies. I think the developers really wanted Marth to cap out his level for his showdown with the final boss, and these two factors make it really easy to do that, even if you're not actively trying that hard to train him. It's at about this time that I'd like to highlight the really cool, iconic human bosses of FE1. You've already met Garneth and Camus, and this map brings us Michalis. I really like these three guys. Not only are they all memorable because they all have personal connections to members of Marth's army, but also because they play radically differently in gameplay. Camus is an honorable guy. He doesn't fight you until he has to, so he guards the throne. Garneth is cocky because he thinks he's invincible, but we'll see how he acts when he's on the back foot next map. And Michalis is ambitious and willing to take the fight to you, so he'll venture out of his castle to attack you. Honestly, my favorite incarnation of Michalis is the FE3 version. There, he's even more aggressive, actively charging you down, and he gains the signature item of the Iote Shield, which protects him from arrows and acts as a complement to the Gradivus and Imhulu. Although, this being the only version where he lacks the signature item means that you can turn his ambition against him by having a sniper lure him over the wall for a massive counterattack. These unique ways you have to approach these three bosses really make him stand out, much more than, say, Geel, the boss of Chapter 14. Geel has plot importance rivaling these three, but interacting with him is no different from interacting with any other general on a throne, so he's much more forgettable. The last point of interest on this map is the Starlight Village. This is the next step on the side quest to get the Falchion. You can actually mess this one up by missing the Thief Anti-Turtle, but I want to focus on it because Godo will actually tell you what you need to do if you screwed up the side quest. He's laid out the plan a couple of times for me, so I can share it with you here so we all have the same baseline understanding of it. We entered Tiki's crypt to get the Light Sphere and the Star Sphere, right? We bring those two to Godo so he can make the Starlight Tome. The Starlight Tome is the only thing that can kill Garneth, and killing Garneth gives us the Falchion, which is the best weapon against Medius. If you lost the spheres or you won't give them to him, then Godo just gives it to you straight here. You're probably fucked. Weapons like the Gradivus, Mercurius, and Devil Axe can probably hurt him, but if you're not getting the Falchion, you are in dire straits. This is a very old school video game thing. You can't beat the final boss by just doing the required tasks of the story. You also need to go on this big side thing. I think this is an idea they executed much better in the sequel story, FE3 Book 2 and FE12. There, doing the bare minimum of going chapter to chapter without doing the side quest still prevents you from reaching the final boss, but players can at least reach the credits. They just get a worse ending. Here, the fact that you're probably not going to be able to reach the credits at all is a twist of the knife that I really don't like. But at least it's not a hard lock, and the game does tell you about your alternatives if you mess it up. Chapter 23, Dark Pontifex. But with Starlight or not, we must carry on into the lair of Garneth. And this being a Garneth map can only mean one thing, a shitload of mages. But it also means another thing, a shitload of Garneths. Yeah, Marth is pretty close to winning this war, and Garneth sees the writing on the wall. He's not going to surrender, but survival is a lot more important than victory. So he's going to make 2 clones of himself and hide in the crowd of the army, hoping to either catch your army by surprise or at least be able to slip away in the chaos. I love the continuity between here and Chapter 15. It really highlights the shift in Garneth's character as the tables turn against him. Again, almost no text in this game, but you can tell that when Garneth doesn't guard the throne in Chapter 15, it's out of hubris, but here, it's out of desperation. Also, a neat way to keep players who didn't get Starlight from getting hard locked out of the game. But that's enough about how the map looks. How does it play? Honestly, I think it's pretty cool. Again, comparing this to Chapter 15, magic users are still a threatening enemy type because every unit in the game up to this point has 0 res unboosted. But since the terrain is flat and you have more pure waters floating around your army, they're much easier to handle, both offensively and defensively. and since the player party is so much better equipped than they were 8 maps ago, the game can ratchet up enemy quality with way more bishops without it feeling overwhelming. And honestly, I think the map flow here is pretty damn good too. You get a lot of early action with this mage squad and the sniper charging you down. The tight action economy I experienced on turn 3 in trying to deal with all these bishops before they closed in on my more vulnerable party members was really refreshing. Turns like this are some of the most fun in Fire Emblem, in my opinion. After that, the map slows down a bit as you climb this spiral tower through a 1-tile choke point. The 4 enemies that will encounter you here can be a bit cloggy, but I don't see that as much of an issue here because your Starlight user will need time to climb this building, and the cool visual effect of the spiral I think is well worth it. Hell, another nice detail of this map is if your army is underprepared to fight the mages, this cleric drops a Pure Water and this one drops a Barrier Staff. Unfortunately, where this map does start to lose me is the boss area. 6 ambush reinforcements will appear out of nowhere on turn 7, including some Thoron bishops. And even though they didn't kill any of my party members, it never feels good to get ambushed like that. Also, I ran into a weird bug here where enemies just would not target Marth. What probably caused it is the fact that I used the Chapter 15 talisman on him. I really do appreciate the fact that luring Garnef away from those chests rewards you with an easier way to deal with mages, but if it also causes enemy mages to ignore you, let the buyer beware. Much like the ambush spawns, this didn't end up being a huge deal, but it threw me off my game and really left me with a bad taste in my mouth. Plus, Hardin ended up dying because I assumed Garnef was stationary when he refused to move to attack Marth. Just a bitter twist on an already sour ending. Also, for those curious, the clones didn't really come up in gameplay. It's very easy to tell which Garnef is the real one by just checking their inventories. I might as well touch on version differences here very briefly, because they are pretty significant. FE3 actually reworks this map entirely. It's the only entirely new map from Book 1 of that game. Although, honestly, I don't really care for the changes there. I think the aesthetic shift of going from the spiral tower in FE1 to more of a dungeon in FE3 makes the map a lot less memorable. Even though it does fit the premise of the map a little better, as Marth is rescuing his sister from captivity in the story. Chapter 24, The Dragonkin Realm. Well, since Hardin went and got himself killed by Garnef, I guess that's as good an excuse as any to try out the side objective of this map. Chapter 24 I see as more of an extension of the final map rather than its own separate thing. The final boss is a Manakete. Make sure the player is prepared to deal with Manaketes. The map can be very short if you let it. By crossing through this 1-tile choke point right at the start, you'll end up very close to the throne, and with the boss being within spitting distance of any Wormslayer Wyvern you might have on you, you can tie things up pretty quickly. The short path still isn't all that pleasant. It's very cloggy, with like 8 dudes all piling into this one tile, but if you have a capped out Marth and a really good source of healing, they can't really threaten you, just annoy you. That said, if you don't address this gap in the mountains, the snipers will threaten your backline here, so you are more or less forced to have someone choke this point. It's about now that people might expect me to talk about supposedly the best personal weapon ever made, the FE1 Falchion, but honestly, it's kind of mid here, so we'll save it until final. A personal that we will talk about, however, is his sister Elise's personal staff, the Alm Staff. In a sense, this is another map built around its side objective. Elise joins with the Alm Staff, but she can only revive characters when she's standing at the temple, specifically on this tile the hero is occupying. So you need to find some way to dislodge the hero and then get her in there. This side quest was significantly changed in FE11, where the Alm Staff is moved from Elise's starting inventory to this chest here, but once you have the Alm, you can use it anywhere. This continues the trend of FE11 trading flavor for function, although I think this is one of the few times that I like the older implementation better. That said, this is another time that I think using the Warp Staff improves the map. Getting a 5-move cleric from here to there with just her legs is boring. Dealing with the hero is the interesting part. I'd recommend just warping her in after that. Also, I would be remiss not to mention the most annoying part of this map, the reinforcements. The final 2 maps in this game feature a massive spike in reinforcement count, with the 8 fort tiles in this map housing over 200 reinforcements, if the .org wiki is to be believed. Dealing with reinforcements is definitely a blind spot of mine in this run because of my regular pace of play, but because I was walking at least to the Revival Shrine, I did get a taste of some of them at the end of the map, and man, I would not blame someone for saying that the reinforcements ruin the whole thing. These guys are so bulky and annoying. If they don't kill you on the first wave, then they just sit there in that choke point, blocking you off from covering their fort tiles, turning this map from one annoying choke point slog into two. I can only imagine what a headache this map would turn into if you don't have a flyer-heavy composition like mine, so covering all these forts would take even longer. The late game fatigue hits you pretty hard here, but we're almost at the end, so let's get this done. Chapter 25, Chosen by Fate. Well, we're finishing up the game, and this map, kind of a dumpster fire. There's no two ways about it. I'm sorry, folks, this map is bad. Let me start off with the good things about this map. Building late game maps is difficult because you don't know what tools the player will have. Here, the FE1 devs assumed that you would have two tools, a capped out Marth and Godo. And I'll be damned, you can pretty much beat the map with just those two. What else? You know, I think the length of the map has some positive qualities. Like, my first successful attempt at this map gave me about an hour of footage, and by the end I was using emulator speedup super liberally. I still think the map when you go at it warpless is way too damn long, but I guess if you're gonna make one map way too damn long, it might as well be the finale. The main factor that contributes to both of these is Marth's third and final personal weapon, the Falchion. The Falchion has three effects that we really care about at this point. It's unbreakable, you can use it as an elixir, and any enemy that attacks Marth from one range, if they aren't a Manakete, has their attack negated. This is insane on paper, and effectively it can let Marth outgrind pretty much anything the map can throw at him, as long as he doesn't deal with too many ranged attackers at once. It also pairs really well with his provoke ability. Heroes and other direct attackers won't realize that their attacks are negated against him, so they'll just go for him anyway. It creates a nice little safety bubble around Marth for your other units. However, there is one big drawback of the Falchion. It forces Marth's animations on, making this map even fucking longer in the process. Honestly, Godo doesn't even matter that much in this chapter, outside of just speeding up the process, so Marth doesn't have to elixir as often. But having staves and being kind of tough to kill means he's not a liability, which is tough to say for basically every other unit in your army. This is the map where the other two big aspects of FE1 preps, the fact that you're always forced into deploying the maximum number of units, and you can't pick their starting positions, really comes into play. This is the only real army split in the entire game, with your army being divided into 4 groups of 3 to 5 units apiece. This is really rough because of the incredibly high enemy quality of the final map. If you don't have a hard carry in each section, the section that doesn't have one is just dead. This is especially brutal for the top right squad, since that is where all your last picks will be, usually including one thief to try and help out with these doors. And let me tell you, these doors are the worst, especially the ones that can lock out Marth from the rest of the map. Realistically, I should have given Marth a door key last map because I knew this door was coming up, but I guess now I can comment on how much more punishing the map is when you don't prepare like this. Your first thought upon seeing the locked door might be to run left and escape through this corridor, but that just baits you into the gimmick of this map, the closing doors. What you need to do is go right and visit the shop and buy a door key there. This shop also does sell bridge keys, which, to be fair, is objectively the funniest thing it could sell, so hats off to the developers there. But with that said, the split party and the constant emphasis on locked doors has definitely led some of you to make comparisons with the final chapter of FE5, so let's compare. The main thing that FE1 finale has over FE5 is that you only really need to deal with 1 locked door at minimum, while in FE5 you need to deal with 6. So while they both probably play pretty similarly when things are going wrong, FE5 has one of my favorite final maps in the series, and FE1 is one of my least favorite because the two of them play completely differently when things are going right. In FE5, your army is divided into 6 groups, each with one specific task they need to complete, killing a boss and stepping on a tile, before uniting and taking on the final boss of the game together. This is satisfying because every branch of your army feels like they're working together to achieve a greater goal. In FE1, the non-Marth groups aren't doing anything. The Falchion is so much better at handling the map than any other tool that the only real goal of these side groups is to join up with Marth as quickly as possible so enemies start ignoring them. That's not a task that's very satisfying to accomplish, but it is a really difficult task because enemy quality, once again, has shot through the roof. So now, your units that could live 3 attacks in the previous map are now dying in 2. And then, once what's left of your army has reunited with Marth, the map shifts its difficulty to something that's less frustrating and more monotonous. You need to cram Marth down this one-tile hallway leading up to Medius, and while he's getting stalled out there, the rest of your army needs to deal with, once again, well over 200 reinforcements, though at least the closing doors can work in your favor here. I speculated in chapters 17 and 20 that a challenge like this, with your main force whittling away at the main objective, while the reinforcements whittle away at you, could be interesting, but I really don't like the execution here, and much like chapter 20, my ability to enjoy the map itself had really withered away to nothing by the time these reinforcements had even shown up. Overall, I don't think this map succeeds at a lot of ideas it tries out, but it does succeed at making you feel like you've just run a marathon by the time the credits roll, and I'd be lying if I said that didn't elevate the satisfaction at least a little bit. And you know, even though the game ended on a bit of a sour note for me, I hope this showed you that Fire Emblem as a series has been innovating and experimenting with what makes a good and interesting map in an SRPG setting since the very beginning. And honestly, overall, I think that here they were shockingly successful. Bringing back the idea that in Fire Emblem you often fight the map just as much as you fight the enemy, I think that's very true here, as shown in my 3 favorite maps from this game, chapters 4, 9, and 10. In all 3 of them, I was pointing out specific, generic enemies that force you to reconsider how you engage with the map and its terrain. Hell, even in maps that I thought were just okay, I was constantly pointing out generic enemies that force you to think about the map in front of you in different ways. Chapter 11, Chapter 15, Chapter 19, it is genuinely all over the game, and it's fucking awesome. I think memorable generics are a very distinct strength of FE1. A lot of ROM hacks, and honestly, a lot of the other mainline games really don't do this to the same degree. And that's a big reason why, despite the combat of this game being very deeply unsatisfying, I had a good amount of fun with this game. Part of me wants to frame this video as a resource for ROM hackers who may want to take ideas from this game and explore them in their own creations. And while that would be amazing, really, I just want to express my love for Archeneia, and for Fire Emblem in general. This game will be 35 years old soon, and even though its mechanics have definitely shown their age in more than a few ways, its map design still provided a damn solid foundation for my favorite game series of all time. Right, also, just a note from the author here. If you've made it this far into the video, I really appreciate it. This has been a fucking monster of a video to make. But if you've made it all the way to the end, you probably think the end result is at least decent, right? So if you don't mind, could you like the video and subscribe? I want to make more of these that are, shorter, but just as good, and that'll be a good motivator. I like seeing the number go up. I want to see the number go up. Yeah, that's all. Thanks.